8:15 a.m., September 24th, 1896, Alameda, California. The crash wasn't what hurt most. It was his mother's face when she found 6-year-old Jimmy Doolittle tangled in the wreckage of his homemade glider at the bottom of the embankment. Rosa Doolittle had learned to expect scraped knees and black eyes from her wild son. But this was different. The boy had built wings. "You could have broken your neck," she said, voice trembling between fury and terror as she pulled splinters from his arms. "But I flew, Ma," Jimmy insisted, blood trickling from his split lip. "For almost 3 seconds, I flew." It was a pattern that would define his life. Attempting the impossible, crashing spectacularly, then immediately calculating what adjustments would make it work next time. The mining camps of Northern California weren't known for producing aviation pioneers. They produced ore, whiskey, and rough men who settled disputes with fists. Jimmy Doolittle excelled at all of it. His father, Frank, had dragged the family from Alaska to California, chasing gold strikes that never quite panned out. They moved constantly, Nome to Seward to Alameda, always one step ahead of creditors, always believing the next claim would be the big one. Young Jimmy learned early that staying put meant getting comfortable, and getting comfortable meant getting beaten by the bigger kids who resented the new arrival. So he learned to fight. By age 12, he'd earned a reputation in the Alameda schoolyard as the scrappiest kid in town, a 90-pound firecracker who'd take on boys twice his size. His nose got broken twice before he was 14. But between brawls, he was reading, devouring every book on mechanics, physics, and the wild new field of aeronautics that was captivating the world after the Wright brothers' success at Kitty Hawk. "You got 2 paths, son," his father told him after Jimmy got expelled for the 3rd time for fighting. "You can be the toughest guy in California, or you can be the smartest. But if you want to actually matter, you need to be both." The words stuck. In 1914, 18-year-old Doolittle enrolled at Los Angeles Junior College, working as a carpenter to pay tuition. He joined the boxing team, not because he loved fighting anymore, but because the discipline and strategy appealed to his analytical mind. He studied opponents like engineering problems, identify weaknesses, calculate angles, strike with precision. He won the Pacific Coast Amateur Championship as a flyweight, then walked away from boxing entirely. "I proved I could do it," he told his bewildered coach. "Now I'm interested in things that actually fly." When America entered World War I in 1917, Doolittle enlisted in the Army Signal Corps' aviation section as a flying cadet. His mother wept. His father shook his hand and said, "Don't just fly, Jimmy. Fly better than anyone else." He did. Doolittle earned his wings in March 1918 and immediately became known as the most reckless, technically brilliant pilot in his class. A dangerous combination. He crashed planes regularly, testing their limits, then wrote detailed reports on exactly why the crashes happened and how to prevent them. His commanders didn't know whether to court-martial him or promote him. The war ended before Doolittle shipped overseas, a disappointment that gnawed at him. He'd spent years preparing for combat that never came, learning to fly aircraft that were now obsolete. But the restless mining camp kid who'd once built wings from scrap lumber wasn't about to let peacetime slow him down. If there wasn't a war to prove what flying could do, he'd just have to prove it another way. 2:47 p.m. September 4, 1922. Pablo Beach, Florida. The Curtiss JN-4 Jenny biplane screamed toward the beach at 140 miles per hour, wings wobbling, engine coughing black smoke. First Lieutenant James Doolittle hung upside down from the lower wing, one hand gripping a strut, the other hand waving to the crowd. The assembled officers and engineers from McCook Field watched in horrified fascination as Doolittle performed what he called accelerated stress testing, and what everyone else called suicidal showboating. He'd been ordered to demonstrate the structural integrity of the new wing design. His interpretation of demonstrate involved aerobatic maneuvers that hadn't been invented yet. "He's going to kill himself," muttered Major Carl Spatz, watching through binoculars. "He's been going to kill himself for 5 years," replied Captain Hap Arnold. "Somehow he never does." Doolittle rolled the aircraft inverted again, dropped 500 feet in a deliberate spin, then pulled out so close to the water that his wheels kicked up spray. The Jenny touched down on the beach perfectly, engine still running. Doolittle climbed out, leather jacket spotless, and walked over to the engineering team with a clipboard. "Wing flutter initiates at 127 miles per hour in a 60-degree bank," he reported, voice calm, as if discussing lunch options. "Strut vibration frequency increases proportionally with airspeed until structural resonance at 145 miles per hour. I'd recommend reinforcing the forward spar attachment points. Otherwise, solid design." This was Doolittle in the 1920s, part daredevil barnstormer, part research scientist, entirely unpredictable. While other military pilots were content flying mail routes and reconnaissance patterns, Doolittle had talked his way into the Army's experimental test pilot program. His approach to aviation research was simple: fly the aircraft until something broke, then figure out why it broke, then fix it. The crashes were frequent and spectacular. He'd walked away from at least a dozen wrecks that should have killed him, emerging from twisted wreckage with the same analytical detachment, already mentally writing the accident report. His logbook read like a catalog of near-death experiences. Engine failure over the Rockies, structural failure over Texas, fuel system fire over Ohio. But between the crashes, he was revolutionizing aviation. In 1922, he made the first coast-to-coast flight in under 24 hours, a feat that made national headlines and proved that aviation could be practical, not just theatrical. In 1925, he won the Schneider Trophy race in a Curtiss R3C2 seaplane, setting a world speed record of 232 miles per hour, then promptly crashed the same aircraft 2 days later, testing its limits. His commanding officers didn't know what to do with him. He was too valuable to ground, too reckless to promote, too brilliant to ignore. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The Army, recognizing that aviation was becoming more science than daredevilry, offered to send promising officers for advanced engineering degrees. Doolittle jumped at the chance. "You want me to go to school?" he asked, incredulous. "I've been crashing planes for science. Now you want me to actually study science?" "We want you to understand why you keep surviving," his commander replied. "Then maybe you can teach the rest of us." In 1923, Doolittle enrolled at MIT to pursue a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, one of the first ever awarded in the field. He spent his days studying advanced mathematics and propulsion theory, his evenings test-flying experimental aircraft, his nights writing his dissertation on wind velocity measurement. He earned his doctorate in 1925, becoming Dr. James H. Doolittle. But he never stopped being Jimmy, the mining camp brawler who'd built wings from dreams and determination. The combination would change history. 9:12 a.m., September 24, 1929. Mitchell Field, New York. The canvas hood covered the cockpit completely, sealing Lieutenant Doolittle inside the consolidated NY-2 biplane in total darkness. Outside, safety pilot Benjamin Kelsey sat in the rear cockpit, hands hovering near the controls, ready to take over when the inevitable crash began. "You sure about this, Jimmy?" Kelsey's voice crackled through the speaking tube. "Not even a little bit," Doolittle replied, eyes fixed on the primitive instrument panel glowing faintly in the darkness. "But being sure is overrated. What happened in the next 15 minutes would transform aviation from a fair-weather sport into an all-weather science. Doolittle was attempting something every expert said was impossible: taking off, flying a complete circuit, and landing, entirely by instruments, with zero visibility. Pilots in 1929 flew by sight and feel. You watched the horizon, felt the wind, sensed the aircraft's attitude through the seat of your pants. The idea of flying blind, trusting only instruments, was considered suicide. Spatial disorientation killed pilots regularly. Without visual reference, the human inner ear couldn't distinguish up from down, level from banking. Pilots who entered clouds often emerged in death spirals, convinced until impact that they were flying straight and level. But Doolittle had spent 2 years working with the Guggenheim Fund for the promotion of aeronautics, developing instruments that could replace a pilot's senses: an artificial horizon showing pitch and bank, a directional gyroscope for heading, a sensitive altimeter for precise altitude. The math said it should work. Now he just had to prove his life on it. "Throttle up," he announced, advancing the power. The NY-2 accelerated down the runway. Doolittle's eyes locked on the artificial horizon, ignoring every instinct screaming at him to look outside. The attitude indicator showed the nose rising. He was airborne, climbing, but his body insisted he was still on the ground. The disorientation was immediate and terrifying. "You're drifting left," Kelsey warned. Doolittle corrected, trusting the directional gyro over his own senses. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. His inner ear said he was banking right. The instruments said wings level. Every pilot instinct told him to rip off the hood and look outside. He forced himself to breathe, to trust mathematics, to believe in physics over biology. He climbed to 1,000 feet, leveled off, executed a standard rectangular traffic pattern, all under the hood, all on instruments alone. The artificial horizon became his eyes, the gyroscope his balance, the altimeter his sense of up and down. "Beginning final approach," he announced, voice steady despite the sweat soaking his flight suit. Landing blind was the real test. Misjudge altitude by 10 feet, and he'd crater into the runway. Come in too steep, and he'd stall. Too shallow, and he'd overshoot. The altimeter unwound. 500 feet, 400, 300. He reduced power, felt the aircraft settling. 200 feet. Reduced power further. 100 feet. 50. The artificial horizon showed the nose rising slightly. He was in a perfect landing attitude. 20 feet. 10. The wheels touched down so smoothly that Doolittle initially thought he'd misjudged and was still airborne. Then the tail wheel settled, and Kelsey's voice came through the tube. "Jesus Christ, Jimmy, you just landed blind." Doolittle pulled back the hood, blinking in the sudden sunlight. Ground crew were sprinting toward the aircraft, faces showing the same shock as Kelsey's voice. The flight had lasted 15 minutes. It had taken aviation from a barnstorming novelty to a tool that could function in any weather, day or night. The instruments Doolittle proved that day would become standard in every aircraft built thereafter. But more importantly, he'd proven something about himself. When everyone said impossible, his response was to grab a calculator and prove them wrong. It was a philosophy that would serve him well in the years ahead. 1:37 p.m. December 7, 1940. Detroit, Michigan. The phone call reached Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle at his office at the Detroit Board of Commerce, where he'd been working as a civilian executive for Shell Oil Company. He'd left active duty in 1930, convinced that the Army's peacetime bureaucracy would never satisfy his need for innovation. Shell let him tinker with aviation fuel formulas and set speed records. It seemed like the right choice. Until today. "Turn on your radio," his former West Point classmate told him, voice shaking. "Pearl Harbor's been hit. The Japs just bombed the Pacific Fleet." Doolittle stood frozen, listening to the frantic radio reports filtering in from Hawaii. Battleships burning, thousands dead, aircraft destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet, America's primary defense against Japanese expansion, crippled in a single morning. He was 45 years old, technically too old for combat duty, comfortable in civilian life with a wife and 2 sons. Every rational calculation said to stay put, to support the war effort from the industrial side, to let younger men do the fighting. But Jimmy Doolittle had never been good at rational calculations when it came to fighting. He called the War Department before the day ended. "I want back in," he told Hap Arnold, now a General-in-Chief of the Army Air Forces. "Whatever you need, wherever you need it." Arnold's response was immediate. "Report to Washington. We're going to need every pilot who knows how to do the impossible." Within a week, Doolittle was back in uniform, promoted to lieutenant colonel, and tasked with overseeing the conversion of automobile factories to aircraft production. It was important work, critical work, and it was killing him. Every day he pushed paper while radio reports described Japanese forces sweeping across the Pacific unopposed. Wake Island fallen, Guam captured, the Philippines under siege. American morale was in free fall. The public demanded retaliation, but the strategic reality was brutal. Japan's homeland was untouchable. The Pacific Fleet was wrecked. Army Air Force's bombers had the range to reach Tokyo from mainland Asia, but Japan controlled every potential base. The mathematics of range, fuel, and geography created an unsolvable equation. Or so everyone thought. In early January 1942, Doolittle was summoned to a classified briefing with General Arnold and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer, had proposed an idea so insane that it had actually made it up the chain of command. What if we launched Army bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier? The Navy's been clear that carrier-based fighters can't reach Japan and return, Lowe explained, spreading maps across the conference table. But what if we don't use carrier aircraft? What if we use medium bombers, B-25 Mitchells, launch them from a carrier deck, hit Tokyo, and continue west to land in China? Every aviation expert in the room immediately explained why it couldn't work. B-25s were too heavy for carrier decks, their wingspan too wide, their takeoff distance too long. The Navy's longest carrier deck was barely 800 feet. B-25s needed 1,200 feet minimum. The physics simply didn't allow it. Doolittle listened to the objections pile up, then quietly asked, "What if we stripped every unnecessary pound from the aircraft? What if we used the carrier's forward momentum and headwind to generate additional lift? What if we calculated the fuel load to the last gallon?" The room fell silent. "Are you volunteering to prove this can work?" Arnold asked. Doolittle smiled, the same smile he'd worn before every impossible stunt, every near-death test flight, every moment when everyone told him no. "I'll do better than that, sir. I'll lead it." 6:34 a.m., March 3, 1942. Eglin Field, Florida. The B-25 Mitchell bombers sat on a white-painted strip of runway exactly 467 feet long, the length of the USS Hornet's flight deck. Lieutenant Henry Hank Miller stared at the impossibly short runway, then at Doolittle standing calmly beside it with a clipboard. "Sir, you want us to take off in that distance? Fully loaded?" "Not yet," Doolittle replied. "First you'll do it empty, then half-loaded, then full combat weight. Then you'll do it so many times you can do it hungover in a typhoon." This was Doolittle's training philosophy. Practice the impossible until it becomes routine. He'd spent February hand-selecting 24 crews from the 17th Bombardment Group, volunteers only, and he'd been honest about the odds. "This is extremely hazardous. I can't tell you where we're going or what the target is, but chances of survival are average. Chances of coming back are poor. Anyone who wants out, no questions asked. Every hand stayed up. They were all volunteers. Now came the brutal part, teaching medium bomber pilots to think like carrier pilots. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed for carrier operations. It weighed 31,000 pounds fully loaded, had a 67-foot wingspan, and required substantial runway for takeoff. Carrier fighters were light, nimble, designed for short deck launches. The Mitchell was a land-based bomber, being forced into a role that violated every principle of its design. Doolittle approached the problem like an engineering equation. Strip unnecessary weight, remove the lower gun turret, replace heavy equipment with lighter alternatives, reduce crew from 6 to 5, maximize lift, time the takeoff for maximum headwind, launch with the carrier's bow rising on a swell to add upward momentum. Practice until perfect. Drill takeoff procedures until every pilot could hit takeoff speed in minimal distance. The crews trained 12 hours a day. Short field takeoffs until their hands ached. Low-altitude navigation because they'd be flying 200 feet above the Pacific to avoid radar. Night flying because the attack would require precision timing. And constantly, obsessively, practicing getting a 16-ton bomber airborne in less than 500 feet. "You'll get one chance to do this right," Doolittle told them during evening briefings. "One chance to hit the target. One chance to get out of Japanese airspace. One chance to find the landing fields in China. There's no margin for error." He didn't just order the training. He flew it himself, taking off first on every exercise, demonstrating that what he asked wasn't impossible, just improbable. The crews watched their 45-year-old commander, who technically should have been behind a desk, pulling his bomber into the air with runway to spare, and they stopped thinking of the mission as suicide. If the old man could do it, so could they. But there was one detail Doolittle kept from them until late March. The exit strategy was barely a strategy at all. After bombing Japan, they'd fly west across the East China Sea, about 1,200 miles, to land at Chinese airfields. Except the Chinese airfields had no navigation equipment, the crews had no radar, and Japanese forces occupied most of coastal China. They'd be landing at night, low on fuel, in potentially hostile territory, hoping friendly forces found them before the Japanese did. "What if we can't find the airfields?" one pilot asked during a classified briefing. "Then you bail out and evade overland," Doolittle replied flatly. "The Chinese resistance will try to get you out. If they can't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. This wasn't a combat mission with a reasonable expectation of survival. This was a one-way ticket with a slim hope of making it back. And every single crew stayed. 7:38 a.m., April 18, 1942. USS Hornet, 650 miles east of Tokyo. The alarm rattled through the carrier. "General quarters! All hands to battle stations! Enemy contact!" Doolittle was in the Hornet's wardroom reviewing final maps when the announcement froze every officer mid-sentence. The mission plan called for launching at 1:00 p.m. from a position 450 miles from Japan, close enough for the B-25s to reach Tokyo and have sufficient fuel to reach China. They were still 650 miles out, still hours from the launch point. "They've spotted us early," Captain Mark Mitcher said grimly, bursting into the wardroom. "The Japanese picket boat got off a radio warning before we could sink it. The entire operation is compromised." Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the task force from the carrier Enterprise, sent the message that would change everything. "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command. Good luck and God bless you." Doolittle felt the weight of the decision settle on him like a physical thing. Launch now meant launching 200 miles farther out than planned, which meant 200 miles less fuel margin for the already desperate flight to China. Launch now meant arriving over Tokyo in daylight instead of twilight, losing the cover of dusk. Launch now meant every advantage they'd planned for was gone. But staying meant Japanese bombers would find the task force within hours. Meant the carrier fleet, including the Hornet and Enterprise, two of America's three remaining Pacific carriers, would be sitting targets for enemy aircraft. Meaning the mission would be canceled and the months of training wasted. "We launched," Doolittle announced. "Now!" The Hornet's deck erupted in controlled chaos. 16 B-25 Mitchells sat wingtip to wingtip, the deck so crowded that Doolittle's plane, positioned first, had its nose wheel literally hanging over the carrier's bow. Maintenance crews made final checks. Ordnance teams confirmed bomb loads. The pilots, suddenly jarred awake hours earlier than planned, grabbed coffee and tried to process the fact that the mission they'd trained months for was happening right now. Doolittle gathered his crews on the spray-soaked deck. Rain pelted them as the carrier pitched in heavy seas. "Listen up," he shouted over the wind. "The plan's changed. We're launching early, which means fuel's going to be tighter than we calculated. You'll need to learn your mixtures, keep altitude low, and pray for tailwinds. The Chinese airfields have been notified, but they're not expecting us until tonight. You'll be landing after dark with minimal ground support." He paused, looking at the young faces, most of them in their 20s, all of them suddenly realizing how slim their odds had become. "If anyone wants to abort, now's the time. No shame, no questions." Silence. Just the howl of wind and the crash of waves against the Hornet's hull. Lieutenant Ted Lawson finally spoke. "We came here to hit Tokyo, sir. Nothing's changed." Doolittle felt something catch in his throat. These kids, because that's what they were, kids who should have been in college or starting families, were about to fly into almost certain death because he'd convinced them it mattered. "Then we'd better get started," he said quietly. He climbed into aircraft 02344, his co-pilot Dick Cole already running pre-flight checks. Through the windscreen he could see the deck officer, Lieutenant Henry Miller, holding the checkered flag. Behind him, 15 B-25s waited, engines warming, crews strapped in. The point of no return had arrived early. Doolittle advanced the throttles, felt the Mitchell strain against the brakes, and waited for the flag. This was it. The moment between impossible and done. 12:15 p.m. April 18, 1942. 200 feet above Tokyo Bay, the city appeared through the haze like something from a dream. Sprawling, untouched, impossibly peaceful. Doolittle dropped his B-25 to 200 feet above the water. Skimming across Tokyo Bay so low that startled fishermen in boats below waved, apparently thinking the aircraft was Japanese. "There," co-pilot Dick Cole pointed. "Factory district, dead ahead." Through the bomb site, bombardier Fred Bramer acquired the target. Kanto Army Arsenal, a sprawling military factory complex in northern Tokyo. The primary objective, the entire reason for 6 months of planning, 3 months of training, and a carrier task force risking everything to get 16 bombers within range. "Bomb bay doors open," Bramer announced, his voice steady despite the fact that they were flying level over the capital of an empire at war, in broad daylight, completely alone. That was the surreal part. There was no resistance, no anti-aircraft fire, no interceptors scrambling to meet them. The Japanese Air Defense Network, designed to detect threats from the sea at long range, hadn't imagined that enemy bombers could penetrate this far. Their radar stations were positioned to catch high-altitude formations, not low-level attackers screaming in just above the waves. Tokyo didn't know it was under attack until the bombs were already falling. "Bombs away!" Bramer called. Doolittle felt the aircraft lurch upward as 500 pounds of incendiaries and high explosives dropped free, tumbling toward the factory complex below. He didn't wait to observe results. Staying over the target meant dying over the target. He banked hard west, adrenaline and training taking over, pushing the throttles to maximum power. Behind him, 4 500-pound bombs struck the Kanto arsenal, erupting in overlapping fireballs that consumed 2 factory buildings and sent debris spiraling into the sky. Workers scattered. Sirens began wailing. Too late. Far too late. The radio crackled. Multiple crews reporting successful bomb runs across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Nagoya. Lieutenant Travis Hoover hitting a steel mill. Captain David Jones demolishing an oil refinery. The reports came in matter-of-fact tones, as if this were a training exercise and not the first hostile attack on the Japanese homeland in centuries. But the real impact wasn't measured in factories destroyed or casualties inflicted. The real impact was psychological. For 16 months since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese population had been told their homeland was invulnerable, their defenses impenetrable, their empire unstoppable. The military leadership had promised that American forces would never reach Japan's sacred soil. Now, at 12:18 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, bombs were falling on Tokyo. School children watched from playgrounds as American bombers roared overhead at rooftop level. Office workers in downtown Tokyo saw explosions bloom across the industrial districts. Emperor Hirohito himself, regarded as a living god, was briefly evacuated from the imperial palace as air raid sirens screamed across the city. The material damage was modest. Several factories damaged, a few military installations hit, civilian casualties minimal. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. If American bombers could strike Tokyo with impunity, what else had the military been lying about? If the homeland wasn't safe, what were all the victories in China and the Pacific worth? Doolittle didn't know it as he raced his B-25 west toward China. Fuel gauges already dropping toward critical, but his 18 seconds over Tokyo had just accomplished something no American victory at sea or on land had managed. He'd shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Behind him, air raid sirens wailed across a city that had never imagined it would need them. Ahead, 1,200 miles of ocean, Japanese fighters, failing fuel, and the slim hope of reaching China before everything ran out. 9:47 p.m., April 18, 1942, somewhere over eastern China. The fuel gauge read empty, had been reading empty for 20 minutes. Dick Cole watched the needle sitting on the E, waiting for the engines to cough and die. "We're flying on fumes and prayers," he muttered. Doolittle peered through the windscreen into absolute darkness. They'd been in the air for 13 hours. The coast of China had passed beneath them 40 minutes ago, or what they hoped was China. In the darkness and rain, it could have been Japanese-occupied territory, could have been ocean, could have been anything. The plan had been to reach the Chinese airfields at Chuchao before dark, land safely, refuel, and proceed to Chongqing, where Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's forces would receive them as heroes. But the plan had assumed launching from 450 miles out, not 650, had assumed daylight navigation, not this blind stumbling through storm clouds, had assumed enough fuel. "Radio's dead," Navigator Hank Potter reported. "Can't raise the Chinese airfields. Either they're not transmitting or we're too far south." Too far south meant they'd overshot the safe landing zones. Meant they were over territory contested between Chinese nationalists, communist forces, and Japanese occupation troops. Meant even if they survived the landing, they might not survive the ground. The port engine coughed, sputtered, caught again. "That's it," Doolittle announced, voice calm despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. "We're not making the airfield. Prepare to bail out." It was the outcome he'd known was likely, had war-gamed during planning, but had desperately hoped to avoid. Parachuting into unknown terrain, at night, in a storm, over potentially hostile territory. And he wasn't just responsible for his own crew. 15 other B-25s were scattered across these same skies, all of them low on fuel, all of them lost, all of them about to make the same desperate choice. "Set autopilot on westerly heading," he ordered. "We'll jump in sequence. The aircraft keeps flying until it runs out of fuel and crashes somewhere unpopulated. Hopefully." Cole set the autopilot. Potter gathered the maps and mission documents. They'd been ordered to burn anything classified before capture. But there wasn't time. Bramer checked parachutes one final time. "Been an honor, sir," Cole said, offering his hand. "We're not dead yet, Dick," Doolittle replied, shaking it anyway. "Now get out before we are." One by one, the crew bailed out into the screaming darkness. Doolittle went last. Captain leaves last, even when the ship has wings. He pulled the ripcord at what he estimated was 3,000 feet, felt the jarring snap of the chute deploying, then hung suspended in absolute blackness, rain pelting his face, the sound of his aircraft's engines fading as it continued west on autopilot. He hit the ground hard. Turned out he'd been much lower than 3,000 feet, and lay stunned in what felt like mud. Chinese mud or Japanese mud, he had no idea. He'd just led the first attack on Tokyo in history. And now he was lying in a rice paddy, somewhere in China, with no weapon, no radio, no idea where his crew was, and Japanese patrols potentially minutes away. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh. Around him, across hundreds of miles of Chinese countryside, 75 other American airmen were having similar moments of disorientation and dark humor. Some would be rescued by Chinese villagers who risked execution to shelter them. Some would be captured by Japanese forces and face war crimes trials. Some would die in the crashes or from injuries sustained during the bailout. But all of them, every single one, had proven that Tokyo wasn't untouchable. 11:23 a.m., May 19, 1942. The White House, Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as reporters pressed him for details about the mysterious air raid on Tokyo that Japanese radio was still frantically trying to explain. "Mr. President, can you confirm American aircraft bombed Japan? The Japanese are claiming minimal damage but seem extremely agitated." Roosevelt's smile widened. "I can confirm that American forces conducted operations against the Japanese homeland. As for where the aircraft came from," he paused for dramatic effect, "I can only say they came from our new secret base at Shangri-La." The reporters laughed, recognizing the reference to the fictional Himalayan paradise. The president wasn't going to reveal carrier operations, wasn't going to compromise the Navy's tactics, wasn't going to give Japan any intelligence advantage. But the laughter masked a deeper truth. The Doolittle raid had accomplished exactly what it needed to. Materially, the damage was modest. 16 aircraft had struck targets across Japan, causing limited physical destruction. All 16 bombers had been lost, either crashed in China or ditched along the coast. Of the 80 airmen, 3 had been killed in crashes, 8 captured by Japanese forces, 3 of whom would be executed, and 69 eventually made it back to American lines after harrowing escapes through Japanese-occupied China. By conventional military metrics, it was barely a tactical success. But wars aren't won by metrics alone. The psychological impact rippled across 3 nations like an earthquake. In America, the raid was a desperately needed morale boost after months of defeats. Headlines screamed, "Tokyo bombed," "Doolittle does it," "Japan's homeland attacked." The public, demoralized by Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, suddenly had proof that America could strike back. In Japan, the impact was far more devastating. The military leadership, humiliated that their impregnable defenses had been penetrated, recalled 4 fighter groups from offensive operations to defend the homeland. fighters that would have been crucial at Midway Island 6 weeks later. The Imperial Navy, furious at the embarrassment, accelerated plans for the Midway operation to extend their defensive perimeter, leading directly to the disastrous Battle of Midway that shattered Japanese naval dominance. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, reportedly said, "The Doolittle raid caused me great concern. It was clear that if such attacks continued, our cities would be laid waste." He was right. The B-29 firebombing campaigns of 1944–45 did exactly that. And for Doolittle himself, the consequences were immediate. He'd expected a court-martial for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and promotion to Brigadier General, skipping over the rank of colonel entirely, one of the fastest promotions in Army history. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and the 8th Air Force in Europe, becoming one of the most important air commanders of the war. But on September 19, 1993, when the 80 surviving raiders held their final reunion, Doolittle, then 96 years old, didn't talk about promotions or medals. He talked about the Chinese villagers who'd hidden American airmen at risk of execution, about the 3 raiders who'd been beheaded by the Japanese, about the crew members who never made it home. "We struck a blow," he said quietly, "but the real heroes were the ones who paid the price we didn't have to pay." The Doolittle raid lasted 18 seconds over Tokyo. Its echo never stopped.